Now we're going into the deep waters. We're swimming into deep, deep, deep waters. Okay, so I'm going to go back, and this one I added a little bit more about the Torah itself because we skipped that part, and I wanted to do it when we have a chance. What are the books of the Torah? What do they contain? So today we're going to have a big, quick summary of the books of the Torah. What happened between Exodus and reaching the Promised Land? There's 2 points. Exodus from Egypt, it's going to be on this side, and the Promised Land. And there's 40 years in between. And these 40 years are covered in Exodus from 14, the crossing of the Red Sea, all the way to Deuteronomy 32. The whole books of the Bible, of the Torah, except 1.5 books, which is Genesis and first half of Exodus, is going to be, or the first third of Exodus, is going to be outside, but the 2/3 of Exodus and the rest of the books, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, will be covered in that trip. What events happened by Mount Sinai, Kadesh Barnea, and the end of the desert wandering, which we call the plains of Moab? And the plains of Moab, there's a specific area. By the way, 8:4 and 8:5 are the plains of Moab, but one of them is a different town than the other. The first town is called Kadesh Barnea, and today they think it is, you know, where is Kadesh Barnea? Today they think it is Petra. You know the word, the city of Petra? That's where they think Kadesh Barnea is. And the other one is Acacia Grove, and I don't know what contemporary places is. But they both, 8:4 and 8:5, is the plains of Moab. Now, the reading will be, like I said, from chapter 20 all the way to Deuteronomy. If you want to read something, you know. The first group of books in the Old Testament are the 5 books of Moses, known as the Pentateuch. Pentateuch is the Greek for the 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The narrative of the story of salvation is found in the 3 books. Genesis, the first half of Exodus, and Numbers, while the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy are books of laws and commandments and contain little history, little narrative. This group of books is called the Torah, or the books of the law. So we spoke about Genesis. We're just going to go quickly over it. I don't want to spend more time because we spend a lot of time on Genesis. It's a narrative book. It's all story, 50 chapters, all story. And it contains the creation, the 4 major points: the creation, the fall and the beginning of nations, the covenant relationships that God has with his people, Adam, Noah, and Abraham. You can say Adam was not a covenant. He created them in a family. He created him inside of it. It's almost like a relationship between a father and child. They don't make a covenant with your baby. The baby is born in your family. It's almost like spontaneous. That's why Adam is a little bit unique. He's born into this. He's born in the image of God. He's born into the greatest relationship ever. But then Noah becomes a covenant because you're bringing someone who has left back to the relationship. Same thing with Abraham. And we said, what's the difference between Noah and Abraham? Remember? Noah is, the covenant with Noah is renewal of the relationship with Adam. But what about Abraham? I wanted you to keep this in mind. Abraham was a very special covenant. It has 3-fold in it. Abraham was to establish what? Priests. He wanted special people to take care of Noah's family. Noah is the whole humanity. He wants very dedicated people. You need a teacher for a class. You need a president for a country. You need a leader for an army. You need a father for a family. So if the family of God is Noah family, then who is going to be the priest or the leader or the one to lead them to God? Will be Abraham. It's a very special mission to Abraham. The book of Genesis ends with the family of Abraham in Egypt. It's 50 chapters, 40 events, 4 patriarchs, and 13 persons, and 3 covenants. God created everything seen and unseen. We go through this and we went through it, and the chapters is spelled out. This is a summary of the book. The book of Exodus is 40 chapters. It's narrative, 20 chapters only. Non-narrative, 20 chapters. The Greek word for Exodus means exit, leaving, departure. The book begins with the fourth generation of the family of Jacob slavery in Egypt and ends up with them by Mount Sinai. This book ends at Mount Sinai, receiving the commandments and instructions to build the tabernacle. So the book starts in Egypt, it ends in Mount Sinai. So remember, in geography, you have Egypt, you have the Red Sea, you have Sinai, and you have the Promised Land in the map. Egypt, Red Sea, Mount Sinai, the Promised Land. So Exodus is supposed to be going out of Egypt and should have reached the Promised Land. But something happened in the middle by Mount Sinai where they had the covenant. And instead of going to the Promised Land, they went very close to the Promised Land and they started to do what? Wander in the desert. And the movie that I would recommend watching for the geography of it and some leftover of what happened is called Mountain of Fire, the search for the real Mount Sinai, and it actually shows you the mountain of Moses in Saudi Arabia. So this makes much more sense because when I was younger, I studied the book of Exodus when I was actually 15 years old. I don't remember. It was like second year in prep school in Egypt, which is like 8th grade or 7th grade. And I was reading this. Next day, I had a test in Arabic. It was a very boring subject for me. I hated it. So I didn't study the book of Exodus out of love for the book of Exodus, but I studied it. I started reading it out of running away from studying for the test. And after 5 chapters exactly, my whole perspective on the Bible changed because I got attracted big time. It fascinated me. I started reading maybe around 9 o'clock. I finished at 3 a.m. in the morning. It was so much attractive and so much grasping of my attention. And I asked myself, and I was living it. It's almost like imagining everything going on. I said, where in Sinai? We don't have anything. You know, in Egypt, when you grow up in Egypt, every corner in Egypt have an ancient relic, a temple, a tomb, something. You know, people in Upper Egypt, they dig in the ground and they find stuff till today. It is layers upon layers upon layers of artifacts, ancient. Every layer is a different century, a different time. So I said, there's nothing in Sinai. With all these major events happening, thousands and hundreds of thousands of people moving, you can't find anything left over. I couldn't believe it. And then I looked into the maps. I have some books, very few books, but one of them had the maps of the Bible. And I looked for Midian, and Midian turned out to be in Saudi Arabia. And I said, there has to be something wrong with this. I don't know. I don't understand what it is, but I don't get the feeling that we know exactly where this happened. So 2001, I was on the YouTube and it hit me this movie, the Search for the Real Mount Sinai, and I saw this. And it's really explained to me all what the questions I had when I was 14 or 15 years old. That's why I like that movie, and I keep looking at Google Maps or Google Earth to find what they have found more and more. And every year I find something new. They find something new in that place in Saudi Arabia. Anyway, the book of Numbers. It is 36 chapters narrative, and some of it is non-narrative, especially the first 10 chapters. First 10 chapters is non-narrative. The book starts in the desert with God telling Moses to take census of all the Israelites. They call it in Hebrew, by Midbar. By Midbar. What's by Midbar in Hebrew? In short, in the desert, in the wilderness. So it is actually telling the story of Israel in the desert. But in the Greek, it's called Numbers. Why is it called Numbers in the Greek? Because there are 3 censuses. When you listen to most people, they tell you the 2 censuses, but I'm going to tell you there are 3. One, in chapter 1, immediately as it begins, God tells Moses let us make a census of all, listen, I showed you to understand the censuses, of all the males, 20 years and above, the one who had finished their 20th birthday and above. Why? Because their names will be calculated so that when the promised land is divided, each of them will have a portion of the land equal to the other for their families. So why is that? Because he will divide the promised land to them. That's chapter 1. What happens after? What happens after they disobey God and they actually lose their faith and trust in God, and they back out of the deal, and they don't want to enter the promised land, and they start turning around in the wilderness? God said, you're going to turn for 40 years until all this generation, 20 years and above, going through a wandering in the desert for 40 years. God wanted to make sure that all of them is dead before any one of them entered the promised land, because they didn't trust him. So what happens after you finish the wandering, right? They will have to do that survey again, which is chapter 26. So after they finish the 40 years, you have a new generation, the younger ones that were very baby children when they did the first census. So that same census is going to have to be redone. So the new males who had reached 20 years and older will be the one to enter the promised land. Okay? So these are the two big censuses. They're one and the same, but repeated one generation, and the second one is the other generation. What's the third one, which is very important? In chapter 3. So you have chapter 1, the first census in Numbers. Chapter 26 is the last census. The second census and the smaller census is when in chapter 3, God says, I don't want your firstborn anymore. Take them back. They're not consecrated to me. I want the Levites. Why? He said, because when Moses went back from the mountain after the 40 days and saw you worshiping the golden calf, he said, whoever consecrated to God, let him come to me. And when Moses screamed in a loud voice, no firstborn came. The firstborn didn't come. Who did come to him? The Levites. And Moses said, today you need to consecrate yourself to God. Everyone who's worshiping the golden calf, committing a capital crime, and committing adultery, they were like loose. They were loose. So they killed them. So they killed their own family. If they find their family doing this, they would kill them. And Moses says, today you consecrated yourself to God. So they had to change. Count the firstborn males 1 month and older, and replace them with a Levite 1 month and older. And when they counted them, they replaced, and they found that the firstborn are much more than the Levites, so they had to pay money instead of the leftover. This was the 3 censuses in the book of Numbers. Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is all non-narrative. It's 34 chapters. The name of the book comes from the Greek word that means second law. Deuteronomos, the second law, includes Moses' final speeches. Where did he give those speeches? They're all given by the plains of Moab when they were at the border of the promised land. From the first sermon in chapter 1 to 4, the second sermon in chapters 4 to 27, and the third sermon chapter 27 to 34. And I give you some important hints to important stuff about the major accounts. For example, the 10 Commandments second rendering, that's why it's called the second law, in chapter 5. The Shema prayer, chapter 6, we talked about it last time. The reasoning for the gift of manna, chapter 8. The instructions for the king, what you do when you have a king, chapter 17. The prophet like Moses, chapter 18, and can be divided into 3 portions. Those are the 3 sermons. The first speech, the second speech, and the third speech. For example, the most important accounts are actually in the second sermon, because the Shema and the manna and the prophet and the king, they're all in the second sermon. Third sermon had something about it. There's actually at the end, there is the curses and the blessings. He divided the people into 2 groups, and he said to them, they're not going to do it here. But he gave them instructions. When you enter the promised land, there's 2 mountains. Gerizim is one of them, and there's an opposite mountain. One of them is green, very lush. The other one is very dry. It's 2 hills. He said, divide the people who enter the promised land A group stands on this mountain, a group stands on this mountain, and the Levites in the middle. And the Levites would shout curses and blessing. If they say curses, the people who are on the dry mountain will say Amen. If he says blessing, the people on the green mountain will say Amen. So who is cursing and who is blessing? The people are cursing and blessing themselves. That's in chapters 20. I think it's chapter 27, 28. And then he gives the final blessing and the prayer of Moses.